folks. I hope you're all well. Welcome to the second mini lecture for What is Policing in week 1, and we are literally talking about what policing is. It's really quite simple. This is to go with all of your other cool stuff that I've put up online on the Milo site, which I hope you're enjoying working your way through. You can see from the cool PowerPoint slides that I've put together, all of my PowerPoint slides are cool, no, I'm kidding. I've got this really interesting photo. Now I will put those, I'm hoping to actually mesh the slides with these lectures, but I love this particular picture because it demonstrates so many different elements of policing all happening at once. I believe it's a photo that was taken on New Year's Eve in the UK somewhere. So you can see that there's a person laying in the street. He has alcohol. He's clearly very inebriated. There's a scuffle going on behind that police are dealing with in the background. There's, people walking across the street. There's a person here who's having an altercation in the foreground with police as well. And there's other people interviewing people and all of that sort of stuff and keeping a lookout. So this demonstrates a lot of the different things that police have to deal with when they're doing their type of work on a daily basis. So that's what I'm hoping to do this week, is actually flesh out what policing actually is as an activity. Overall, I think it's really important to distinguish between talking about the institution of the police and the types of work that we do, which is what I call policing work. The institution of the police is probably something we'll talk more about when we talk about governance, when we talk about integrity, those types of things. Whereas most of the time I'll be talking about policing work, so the processes and practices involved in different types of police work. Generally, policing is focused on law enforcement, peacekeeping, but it's not just done by police officers. It's also done by citizens now in a move towards what we call pluralisation. So we see a lot of security members, we see a lot of even vigilante groups, neighbourhood watch, all of these types of different, groups do policing work in one way or another. So there's a really nice definition of policing that Jones has that I really like. It says a set of functions and processes that form a subset of organised forms of social control. This includes individuals and organisations involved in regulatory investigation and enforcement activities, part of whose defining purpose is to apply social controls. So in all ways, I suppose, they're involved in the regulation and social control of people and different forms of behaviour. So, what do police do? Well, there's a whole range of different types of behaviours and activities that police are involved in. Morby and Wright have a really great quote that says, "Policing is a multifaceted activity in an increasingly complex and fragmented world." It really couldn't summarise it better, realistically. There are so many different things that they do. The tasks of police are shaped at both formally, where we're looking at governments and the governments are kind of determining what police do, but it's also shaped informally, where a person might walk into a police station and say, "Hey, I really need help with this. This has been happening to me." And that person then shapes what police activity happens in the next, 2 or 3 hours, or it could be months and months down the track that they're still working with these people. But more or less, it is a 24-hour emergency service. They're around the clock. They work all the time on the most unbelievable things at times. Finlay gives a nice outline of the types of tasks that they're involved in. Maintenance, dissemination of information, protection of life and property, of course, maintenance of public order, that's fairly straightforward. But overall, he also argues that it's about ensuring social happiness. And this is something which is a really interesting concept. Not a lot of people, particularly not a lot of police, would suggest that they're kind of responsible for maintaining social happiness. Interestingly enough, though, when you talk to police officers about why they initially, joined the police service, for instance, they will talk about the fact that ultimately they wanted to help people. That's really their drive for being a police officer. But a lot of the time when you talk to them, they'll say, well, we're not supposed, we help people, but we're not social workers. We're not supposed to do that sort of counselling type of work. But realistically, maintaining social happiness is probably a very important part. So the happiness of a person's, of a person might be interrupted, for instance, when there's a domestic violence incident happening in the house next door to them. The happiness of a person might be interrupted when they've had their car stolen. All of these different types of things ensure people's overall social happiness. How a society is policed also depends on who is policed, and this is a really important factor because it's very often not those people who are most privileged who are involved in policing incidents. It's very often the people who are the least privileged in society that come into contact with police, and most importantly, come into contact with police on a day-to-day basis. So, for instance, I'm a research professor. If I wasn't doing research on policing and working with police on a daily basis, I wouldn't see police on a daily basis. I might see them maybe once a week, for example, and very rarely have an interaction with police. They might pull me over for a breathalyzer test. I might see them in the mall, for instance. But for other people, so for a lot of the young people that I speak to in the research that I do, they come into contact with police on a daily basis because they look suspicious. Police will walk up to them, ask them a whole bunch of questions about where they've been, what they've been doing, what their name is, where their current residence is, who the people are that they've been hanging out with. And this will happen sometimes on a daily basis. There's evidence in Victoria that this happens up to 10 times a day for a young person, which is really kind of scary. It happens so often with the young people there that they've had to start issuing receipts. So the young person gets a receipt to say, yes, I've already had this interaction with police, please don't bother me again. It's really kind of scary. So what are the core policing roles then? There's a broad range of tasks: reassurance, crime prevention, crime investigation, emergency service work, peacekeeping, order maintenance, and state security, of course. These are all core functions of what police do. But this is also quite a problematic process. It's complicated by so many different factors. How the individual police officer thinks about their job and what they do, for instance, is a really important one. But it's also complicated by whether or not police are primarily considered a force or a service. And this is something that we talk about in a little online activity that I've put up for you. So a police force, obviously, the word force implies that there's some sort of use of force over a continuum and that they're mainly there to regulate and control people's behaviour. Service, on the other side of the continuum, I suppose, suggests that they're there to deliver care in a lot of ways as well. And a lot of police officers tend not to think about this as their role. I really like a particular quote that Waddington has got about this. He says, "To the extent that police exercise authority over citizens, then policing is hesitant and cautious because citizens have rights. But where the police impose alien authority on a rebellious subject population, then coercive power is exercised with little restraint." And there are a lot of people that really challenge about the ways in which that coercive power is exercised. And we'll talk about that more in a little while. One of the main tasks that police are involved in is law enforcement. And you can see from this slide that that happens in a whole bunch of ways. It happens in traffic policing. It happens in policing people in public spaces. It happens in situations where there's riots or protests, those types of things. So the enforcement of the legislative frameworks that the government puts together is a very important part of what police do. Another really important area of police work is, of course, patrol work. And interestingly enough, this makes up about 60% of police officers' time, depending on where they are and where they're situated geographically and all of that type of stuff. Patrol work can happen in cars, it can happen in boats, it can happen on bikes, it can happen on police officers, it can happen on horses, and of course it can happen on foot when people are walking around in shopping malls. Interestingly enough, it's been found to be not that effective. Overall, patrol doesn't necessarily detect crime and it doesn't clear away crime. So there's other ways that this actually happens for police officers. The chief way that we find and detect, well, that we detect crime and that we clear away crime is investigation work. So this happens when a member of the public comes to police and says, hey, this has happened, or I've found a body in the bush, or whatever it might be, or I've committed a murder. Often people will actually walk in and actually tell the police that they've committed a murder. So this is how we get to know about what crime happens and how we resolve those crimes, and the cases go through court. And of course, there's a whole bunch of different things that they do to investigate. And we'll talk about those when we talk about investigations in a few weeks. Police are also involved in emergencies, and this can be a whole range of different types of things. It can be natural disasters, it can be emergencies which are human instigated, such as terrorist attacks. It can be emergencies where there's massive riot down in the main area of a central business district, and police need to come in and take over and try and get a place under control. It can be situations where they're also trying to find someone, for instance. So there's a whole bunch of different types of emergencies that police are involved in, one way or another. Overall, crime fighting is also part of police roles, but a lot of people question whether or not it's actually crime fighting, whether it's crime detection and clearing away crimes and things like that they're more involved in. So we've got things like crimes against the person, drug offences around different types of illicit substances. We've got robberies, assaults, burglaries, and theft of motor vehicles. And there are just a myriad of statistics online that can tell you about how often these different types of crimes happen in different jurisdictions. So there's other factors which are influencing police roles as well. And these are things that we'll probably talk about more as we go along. Pluralisation is a big one, where it's not just police officers doing this job now. There's a whole range of different people. There's security officers, there's people in neighbourhood watch, there's even people in schools that detect different types of child abuse. There's nurses and hospital staff that are also involved. All of these guys are involved in different forms of policing activity in different ways. So that's what we call pluralisation. It's not just police officers involved in these types of things. Transnational pressures really influence the way policing happens as well. So, for instance, if there's been some sort of tsunami, for example, often police officers in one jurisdiction will be taken and placed into another jurisdiction. And depending on, they may not have ever had any training around human rights, for instance, and depending on what happens in that circumstance can depend on how that policing is actually delivered to those people in those very vulnerable circumstances. Developments in media and information technologies also influence the way policing happens. For instance, there's a little cartoon on this particular side that says "Don't shoot," and he's talking to the member of the media rather than other people who are trying to shoot him with a gun, for instance, in this particular example. So although, we'd often say, oh, don't shoot to a police officer, the police officer is going, don't shoot to a media person because they don't want it to be recorded. So these things have actually made policing a lot more difficult now. And in fact, I would argue it also makes it a lot more accountable, because police really have to think about what they're doing, because, we have these fabulous things now, which phones, they all have video recording devices on them, and people are often recording police actions in public spaces, so they've got it on record. In addition to that, there's information technologies, there's all sorts of different types of cybercrime. These literally change on a daily basis. So that also influences the way that policing happens, as well as theorising around risk societies, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of weeks. So policing is talked about in many different ways then. There's a law enforcement and crime fighting approaches that we see. Crime as a threat, police as first responders and resolving those types of crime. And we very typically see these types of representations in the media, on TV shows and films and that sort of stuff. Police also have monopoly on use of force. That definitely distinguishes them from the broader community. So, for instance, a police officer can take somebody and arrest them and hold them. That would technically be kidnapping if a member of the community did it. Policing, however, is also service oriented work and order maintenance. There's broader social regulation stuff that I talked about before. There's very little enforcement overall of criminal law, which is quite interesting, that we'll talk a bit about this week too. And there's a lot of patrol work, even though we know that patrol work doesn't necessarily lead to resolving crimes and detecting crimes. Policing is also a bureaucratic institution. There's a lot of administration, there's performance management, there's record keeping, there's key performance indicators that police officers have to fulfill depending on whether or not, depending on what their role is. There's form filling. In fact, 43% of a police officer's time is often spent at a police station doing custody and related paperwork. And of course, policing is just one arm of a very complex criminal justice institution now that most jurisdictions have. I'll get it right eventually. It's one institution in a network of criminal justice institutions, but it's the most important one. Police officers decide who and who does not have to answer for particular types of crime. They decide and use their discretion on a daily basis as to who is going to go into court, who is going to go into prisons, all of those types of things. Of course, they don't technically decide who goes into prison. They just decide whether or not a case should go to prison. So if a person should be arrested, and then the case sent off to court. I just want to end on a final note about policing in history in Australia. It's a very contentious issue amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and for good reason, because they have been very badly mistreated by police in the past. It's a very contentious history involving colonisation, dispossession and repression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And oftentimes it was police that was doing the dispossession, the repression, and unfortunately the colonisation processes here. On the slides that we've got for this, you can see there's an image of the native police there, and there's also an image of police massacring people at a particular Aboriginal people in a particular part of Australia. This means that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are extremely mistrusting of police, and for good reason. Although police have done quite a bit of work, I would argue, and a lot of other people would argue, that there's certain areas that we still need to be doing a lot of work on in order to make policing work more socially just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But unfortunately, that sort of stuff can often be out of their hands. They do have the right to use discretion, but it's the legislative frameworks that need to be looked at as well in terms of how we move forward with making sure that policing is socially just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Look, that's it from me now. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more direction about where we're going with the unit. It's a very broad lecture, obviously, but we'll be talking about all of these issues in a little bit more detail in coming weeks. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And I look forward to chatting with you all again soon. See you later.